This is Sydney.
Hey Sydney, it's Brandon from Castleberry Industries. How are you?
Good, good. How are you doing, Brandon?
I'm fantastic. Hey, do you have a minute?
Yeah, I do. It's so good to hear from you.
Perfect. Absolutely. So we got some really good feedback, Sydney, from the conversation with Ted, and they're very interested to move forward.
That is outstanding news.
So they
Tell me
felt,
more.
yeah, absolutely. So Ted was really excited that you fit in with the team, felt there's a great technical background, and really see a good future here for you as well. So we want to move to the next steps and present you an offer.
Wow, I wasn't expecting it to move this quickly. That is awesome news.
Well, we try to do our best here. So, recovering from the notes, and I wanted to go through things with you to before I can send you the actual written offer. So, this role, as we talked about, is a senior analyst, right? So, it's a promotional side of things for you from your current role. Looking at the offer and the details of the compensation, right? And we did some analysis behind this. I know where you're currently at, and we were able to get you an increase. So the new base salary we're looking at is 100,000 from your current 90. So this is about 11% increase. It's a consistent bonus structure, so it's a 10%, so very similar to where you were. So if you look at total compensation, you were going from about 99,000 now to 110,000. The other side of it is our benefits do start on day one. And our 401k is actually a little bit better from what you told me from the 4%. Ours is 6% match. So you get a little bit of extra bump there as well. The other thing that I just wanted to remind you from the conversation is this is an in office 3 day a week hybrid model. And we're super excited for you to join and grow with us and, join the organization.
Well, one thing I guess I have to weigh out is I recently actually just got a 5% raise. So if I think about where that puts me and this offer, you know, I have to give that some thought because the other factor for me really becomes, going to the office 3 days a week versus my 1 day a week, and the delta being only this 5% now kind of puts me in a position of saying, I'm excited about the opportunity and the promotion's great and all, but financially, you know, I'm not really making the strides I had hoped to.
Well,
And,
from our original conversation, you also felt that you weren't going anywhere in your current role. This is a promotion. There's some growth opportunities here. That's kind of why we started the conversation. And when I reached out to you, that was the interest to continue to move forward.
well, there's a little truth to that. But in fairness, I wasn't really expecting a 5% raise. So that kind of sent me a signal that perhaps I was a little off in my read on, maybe where my career was going. So,
Okay.
I got a lot to ponder here, and again appreciate everything you've done. So I guess I have to sort through this all and kind of figure out where my heart is, and run the numbers a little bit more and weigh out the pros and cons.
Well, I really, I want to be able to send you an offer, but also, our policy is really to put the best offer forward here. I mean, is there something you want me to take back to them? And obviously, you'll want to be we're stretching and pushing forward to get you here and put everything on the table for you. But happy to have a conversation with them. Is there something I could do to, what would it take to get you to sign on the dotted line and so to say?
Well, I mean, maybe this is goes without saying, but the 10% on top of my current salary would certainly make it a lot more, uh, I guess, a lot shorter thought process for me.
Okay. So you got a 5% increase. So you're looking for the 10% on top of your new current. And how recent was that increase?
Just went into effect like 2 weeks ago.
Okay. But you didn't know that was happening. So I guess I'm trying to, I put all the apples on the table here, right? And we're built and having those conversations. And I know we started the process before, but those little things when we reconfirm would have been really helpful. I mean, I'm just doing my best here and advocate for you as best as I can. So let me see what I can do there.
I appreciate it, Brandon. I know you're really fighting for me, and I hope this doesn't doesn't go sideways. Like I said, I've got a lot to think through, and hopefully I'll hear something back from you in a day or two, and we can keep the conversation going.
Yep, let me take this back. Let me go have some conversations, and I will be back in touch.
Thanks, Brandon. Bye.
Appreciate it. Have a great one. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Shambom here with the Talent Revolution. I'm here with my co-host.
Jill Kniglio Kirk.
How are you, Jill?
I'm doing well. How about you, Joe?
Fantastic. Everyone, I'm sure you've heard and tuned in for the first few minutes, a fun little mock conversation that we've had, and kind of here to introduce that new topic that we're going to have today, which is offers. So if you saw that and heard that mock offer, almost everyone is probably shaking their head going, oh my God, I've been there. I've seen it. I've done that. It's happened to me. I mean, Jill, I'm sure it's happened to you throughout your career.
Yeah.
Get those curveballs in those situations. Super frustrating, obviously, as you can do your best as you plan through it all. But man, those curveballs are just hard to catch.
I've been there, Joe. Trust me. And nobody likes a curveball. So I think what we can do best is really try to talk about how to avoid curveballs potentially. And, are there things that you can do to shore up your process to make sure that you don't have those unpleasant surprises? But I have no doubt Brandon's going to come home and bring it around, and Sydney is going to be signing up. So.
Yeah, I sure hope Sydney will. I mean, Brandon, if you heard that mock, you could hear Brandon point out several different factors that he did throughout the whole process, right? When he said, do you remember our first conversation? And, this was a promotional opportunity, and the different highlights that he was giving back to Sydney on, how that offer got presented and built up for her to get that curveball of a promotion. And it happens, but the best set plans are sometimes always unraveled, and
Right.
Things happen that way. I mean, getting all those different ducks in a row, I mean, that's a big piece of getting the offers together, right? Is communicating, it's being transparent, asking all those upfront questions, and especially with this fact of salary, is reconfirming that in multiple conversations. And it sounded like he did that, but didn't get maybe the truth from Sydney's standpoint.
Yeah, I'll be honest, candidates aren't always predictable or easy to manage, right? We've all kind of struggled with that. But what I will say is there's nothing more disappointing than investing the time, finding the candidate that's a fit, knowing that the candidate wants the opportunity. And I think at that point, you've put so much time in the process, your best bet is really like, let's find some common ground and let's find a way to make this work, right? Because the time costs money, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and I think it's a clear illustration of how do we perhaps, and maybe money's not the answer, but how do we continue that dialogue, try to get everybody on the same sheet of paper and get that offer kind of closed and get that alignment so we can make sure our candidate is ready to start.
Yeah, in that scenario, there's not that far off in compensation and money. And there's a couple ways that I would go about going after that is whether you increase the base salary or not. Maybe there's a sign-on bonus or something else there. The other little thing, if everyone picked up, which is a nuance nowadays after COVID, is the in the office situation, right? And the return to the office is a huge aspect now that obviously was brought up, and there was an in-person interview that went on in that, or at least I believe there was, to get that touch point there. But to combat that, that's a separate piece, and that's a conversation maybe that you connect the hiring leader with the person to help firm up that offer in the end. But again, it's always going back to being transparent and laying that out, so therefore there are less surprises and curveballs at the end, at the last side of it. Thinking about that, what other putting that competitive offer together, right? How would you, I mean, from the HR standpoint, Jill, put that together? What frameworks, what tools, or things have you used in your career?
Well, I mean, I think it all starts with understanding the role and the competitive salary range for the role. No matter how good the candidate is, there really needs to be, a range that this role, is worth as far as the business is value on the role. That is where for me, everything starts, right? So we kind of have maybe, in my world, it's a mid, and max for a role, right? And then I'm thinking about, what are my organizational needs, based on the experience that this candidate brings, where do I see them fitting into that range? And then I think outside of, the technical part of the comp analysis piece, it really is who is the internal peer group, and how do I balance this external candidate's needs with my internal peer group, and how does that look? Am I going to create any kind of potential um, dissatisfaction by bringing a candidate in from the outside with less experience at a higher salary, perhaps, right, to my internal group? So I think it's really looking at both of those factors as kind of square one. And I think, of course, some other practicalities go into it, such as, how is this team performing, right? How critical is this need? Perhaps I could like get over a percent or two or so in a situation where, things aren't working well in the organization. And, I think we all have to be realistic about what the business needs from a candidate. And if things are humming in that department, I might be a little more stingy. And if things are really not humming and I need to kind of rev up the engine, of that group, then perhaps, I factor those things in as well. So I think it's a combination of some science and a combination of, just kind of practicality.
Pulse on the group is what I also hear in that piece of it. I want to dive into two quick things though, and this is I guess get your take on the HR side. And there's a lot of salary ranges that folks use, right? And all these different levels. And compensation, I think, is going to be another topic and session that we can dive into. So I don't want to go too far, but I've been in organizations where here's your salary range by level, and it was across all disciplines. So the next thing you know, that level is like $80,000 or whatever the number is. It's a huge window into that spectrum. I mean,
Yeah.
versus, and I get it, it's more work and more things to be able to put specific ranges around by each discipline and different sides of
Well,
it. But what's your take on that?
I think you are absolutely right on track because let's be real. We know certain skills are hotter than others. And, you might see a delta for a software engineer versus an electronics and, electrical engineer. And what is that factor? So I think organizations that aren't taking those things in consideration are probably not competing for top talent. So I think you really need to understand your market, what skills are hot, and what parts of the country really come to play as well, right? There might be overages of certain skills in certain parts of the country, while it's, a scarce commodity in other parts of the country. So you really need to know your own talent market and, what it's going to take to really, land that candidate. So I think you absolutely need to be open and understanding what skills are paying what premiums in the market and be in touch with that.
That's where I'm frustrated. I don't say frustrated, but it's disappointing to look at a huge salary range for every discipline in this level across. Doesn't make sense if you're going after an analyst like we did in that mock versus an engineer. There's a bigger gap into that piece. Now, the electronics and software is going to be smaller in essence, but that's a separate conversation. But I just wanted to get your take for everyone's side of that piece of it. The other side of the offer, and I know we talked a lot about money, but it's the total package, right? And he mentioned that in the conversation. Look at your total package, right? The offer, the benefits, the 401k, the promotional opportunities, the growth within the company. And that's, from the recruiting standpoint, you want to talk about selling the candidate, you're selling all of that, right? That Ted was the manager and he thought you had a great potential and you fit well with the team. So you're hitting all these points which bring a total compensation and total fit within that conversation versus here's the money, do you want to take it or not, right? It's that whole
Right. Well,
package.
yeah, and I would just say that I believe that the exceptional talent acquisition people and HR people are getting to know that candidate uniquely and what they place value on, right? If they're doing their
Right.
homework and they're doing their job correctly, they know what their must-haves are and they know what their breaking points are going to be, saying they'll walk if I force them in the office 3 days, they'll walk for X. So I think it's not as much about you're obviously correct in saying understanding all of those things and what buttons you can push and how to sell that whole package to the candidate's important. But I think what is more important that, exceptional professionals do beyond, what you described is really saying, I know this candidate and I
Right.
know what's meaningful to them. I know they're, either have a family or they don't have a family, you know, not that you have to probe and ask those questions, but those things may lead you to understand medical important on day one is absolutely critical to this person. They value 401k. Um, there are other candidates out there. Maybe it's all about potential growth and what
Hmm.
investment this company is going to be making me. So I would just say every recruiter or HR professional who's working in this realm needs to understand that candidate and what that offer needs to look like and what those bargaining chips are, right? Because
Yeah.
certain ones have a way more important value and an emotional value that, doesn't, there's a price tag on everything, but sometimes that emotional value really is important, right?
100%. Yeah, that's the candidate experience. That's the relationship that you have with the candidate throughout the whole process, right? And it's taking all of those notes down to be able to sum that back up. And while you're putting that together and that whole offer discussion that you're having, the one thing that I would say that was missing out of that mock was really the experience having it with the manager, right? The manager didn't come into that conversation
Hmm.
giving that extra level of we want you, right? We feel this, and
Right,
then
right.
questions regarding the position or the role or the group.
Yeah.
I could see that as a added value in that
Well,
discussion.
and I personally think that that is the next phone call, that Brandon needs to take that to the manager and say, "Hey, Brandon briefed me on the conversation, Sydney, that you had today," and have an open dialogue about all of those important things around development and all those other things, saying, "Hey, I want you to know we are going back to the drawing board, but reinforce all of those things that Sydney found important, as far as her
Yeah.
attraction to the opportunity." And I think involving the manager in the process is really a smart strategy, especially when things are a little bit rocky. And of course, every company has their own approach and, how they want to handle situations like offers. Whose job is it? Who's involved in the process? But I do think, in our mock that we just did, it's a perfect opportunity for that manager to reach
Mhm.
back out, say they're aware, let Sydney know that they really want to see this work and reinforce those points of why they want her on the team. And I think that'll really go a long way in setting this experience up for success. Um,
Absolutely. I think, it's one of those things of I've done that and included the manager, whether it's upfront before that conversation or
mhm.
maybe even afterwards, in a sense of, get the next, second offer or the full final offer together, put it there, present it, and then have the manager come in either on that call and then leave or right afterwards that follow up. There's a couple different strategies and
Yeah.
everyone
I
can pick
I
that apart, but
personally love that you mentioned kind of doing it jointly. I think that managers deal with a lot of unpleasant things in their jobs, and including them in a positive conversation,
yeah.
letting them kind of be the voice to the person that is potentially going to be on their team is a really wonderful opportunity to include them. um, I have also kind of come out of those conversations, maybe realizing that the leader has a little different level of respect for what we do in HR and talent acquisition when things have gone a little sideways or we've had to pivot, right? But I do like that idea personally of having this joint call and it kind of being a partnership and kind of getting everybody on the same page. That's just my personal commentary.
No, I mean, the manager kicked off the process, right? They should help. I mean, obviously not end it there because they're going to hopefully get on board and the whole process afterwards. But right near the end, don't cut
Hmm.
them out of the fun joy of here's our selection, here's why we want you, and here's how it goes. Yes, the financial aspects and the details of corporate policies are there that the recruiter is well and more capable to handle, but give that positive and that we want you. Here's the details. Here's what the role is. Here's how you're going to make an impact. Get them all hyped and excited behind it. And obviously take care of any concerns that they have. I think those are huge things that many companies unfortunately miss because they say, oh, well, that's HR or that's TA. They'll take care of it. But it's really, they're part of it. And there's been times they've loved it and they've been part of it going, what, really? I get to make this phone call? I go, yeah, but don't talk about the comp. Don't talk about the numbers, right? Let me take care of that. But
Right.
make the offer saying we want to have you come on board. And there's been some managers that obviously you had to coach them sometimes a little bit to make sure they don't say anything wrong. But they've been super excited about it and be like, they take joy out of that.
Right. No, I also would agree with you in saying you have to be clear up front and saying, when it comes to negotiations, that's not your role.
Right.
Let me handle that piece. Everybody kind of walks in with, this is my part, this is your part. There's some planning, and you don't trip on each other, right? And every person understands what their role in that conversation is. I think that's very wise advice. And when it comes to negotiations, right? I think you definitely want to leave that to your HR team and your talent acquisition people in your organization.
Speaking about negotiations, and if you heard that conversation at the start, if you haven't, go back to the start of this session, everyone. But the flags, right? There's a couple flags that I think got pointed out in a positive and negative way, right? Sydney was excited. It was, oh, great. You sped the process up. I didn't expect it so soon, which is a positive. The tone of her voice was positive in those things. From a recruiting standpoint, the curveball and the piece of, oh, I just got this salary increase and she didn't share that, right? And she going into this that hopefully an offer is coming, but then throws, hey, I already got an increase and they didn't tell the recruiter. I wouldn't say that's lying. It's not a lie. It's not disclosing everything. A little bit of a flag, not major, but did you see any other flags in that conversation, Joe?
Well, I mean, I would agree, not being upfront with the recruiter saying, hey, there's been a change in my comp. I know we're in the middle of this process, right? That was an opportunity for Sydney to kind of reach out, probably like maybe in a note saying, hey, I know we
Right.
were initially talked about this, I just want to be in full disclosure. So I would agree, the ideal candidate is maybe being upfront about those things. But I also think it's fair for us to recognize, especially when we're dealing with non-HR professionals, right? That they are awkward and they don't know how to handle those situations. So I think it's definitely real world, and we see it. We see it often when people really don't know how to navigate those conversations, right? Um, so I would just say for me, I could see both sides of it. I think the
Yep.
ideal candidate is being upfront, and hopefully the recruiters maybe continually inviting the candidate, say, hey, if anything changes along the way,
Right.
please make sure you keep me in the loop, right? So maybe there's opportunities there to kind of beat that into the candidate. Um, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
And we could tell candidates, things till we're blue in the face, and perhaps they don't follow that advice anyway, right?
Then
So,
the other nice part is she was positive and hopefully this can work out where, was interested in the role, doesn't want to ruin this opportunity. So there were some good flags the other way, right?
mhm,
Showcasing
mhm.
that um, she was, listening to that. Obviously it was a mock, everyone, but I felt that that's something I could have turned around with the right, maybe a little bit of
Right,
some type of comp structure piece we could have put
right,
together to make that deal
right.
happen. So
Well, and I think that the example illustrates a real world situation we're seeing today, where there's also an intangible, meaning time in the office, this
yeah.
hybrid, how many days a week, that comes to play, that it's hard to put a dollar sign on when you're really, looking at offers for candidates. But I find that that is becoming more and more the trend, where there's something that's not a kind of a nut or a bolt that's really kind of got candidates' attention, and that's what they're fixated on. So I think organizations need to take a step back and realize those things. Perhaps can they communicate those things more upfront in the process, right? What are the strategies organizations want to take to not have that disconnect later? You know, I do see that becoming a trend, and it becoming somewhat of a more challenging situation to solve than, some of the dollars and cents issues.
Yeah, there is, and I don't know what the answer is, and I've tried several things in my career, and there was times I know we do stories at different times, but this one comes up really well here, where we were having some declined offers in a certain particular area, and it was like, what are we going to do? Because they were all of a sudden not willing to relocate, and then all of a sudden their partners weren't interested in moving as well, so as part of the relocation, and then the comp was an issue, and it's like I had the recruiters honestly do a recap. So it was a recap of the conversation, then sending that email off to the candidates, and then making them, in essence, respond saying, yes, everything is correct. So you said you're willing to relocate. You said your salary is X, right?
Hmm.
Not an it wasn't a binding agreement, but at least it gave transparency back to twofold. A, the candidate saying you did agree to this and you did say yes, right? That's not going to hold them in any court. It's not like you're going to take them to court or anything.
Right.
But it's also back to the hiring leaders and the other HR leadership going, listen, guys, this is what they're telling us and this is what's happening, right? And they
Right.
confirm those things. So it was a little bit of CYA going on in those situations because we kept getting burned in that situation. And it was like, not trying to point the blame somewhere else. We've got to, TA's got to be held accountable to find the right candidates to go through. But, I know we want to talk about metrics, but this was part of the metrics piece of declined offers. You think
Hmm.
about cost of interviewing, right? You go through all the way through the process with managers and multiple levels of interviews. And next thing you know, they're declining and that they were selected. So great, we got the right candidate. Bad, they didn't accept. And now the time lost and money
Right.
lost and frustration gone through it. So
Right.
I mean, if other people have great ideas, please put them in the comments, share some stories and tips and tricks to mitigate some of these situations. And that was just a quick story that I had.
Right.
Um, but summing back into that was metrics, Jill. I mean, metrics on offers, there's the typical ones of obviously declined offers and acceptance rates. Have you seen anything else in your career or that you'd want to measure for offers?
I have not done this personally, but I would love to know the answer to this. And what I'd like to understand is kind of like what the starting salary of an offer was versus kind of the creep, right? Like in
Okay.
essence, how off were we in our assumptions perhaps when we walked into this process? So that's just
So
one
you
that
mean
piques my
from
curiosity. Like in essence, starting offers overall in aggregate versus offers accepted, right? The like
the
version one
percentage
offers, right?
increase?
Versus signed offers.
Interesting. I've never thought about that. If anyone listening has done that, I would love to see that in their situation and how that helped them. But yeah, that would get an accuracy point that gives you some data in the market to see how accurate we were. Obviously, now at times, way back when I started, you could ask candidates flat out, "What are you making?" and actually ask for a pay stub, and you can't do that now. So you're asking, what are you looking for in your next opportunity and what other financial constraints or things do you have to be able to hopefully come up with that. And a lot of the times in my career, folks just end up being transparent, say, Joe, you know what, I'll just tell you where I'm at. Great. That's very helpful,
Right.
to be able to then build out. And because I've done this multiple times, is you're putting a side by side comparison together on compensation and showing it to the candidate, saying, here's your current, here's the offer, here's this. And you lay out all the different factors so they can see black and white, here it is. And usually they appreciate that instead of having to do it themselves.
Right.
And I know I'm rambling in a second, but the other part that gets complicated in some of those offers is when you get into some of that stock and stock repayments and vested and unvested amounts, and you're going through the different vesting schedules, and you can get to some really complicated offers as you go through those things. But the transparency really helps, is what's happened to me.
Yeah, and then I would also say that in realization of the market conditions, it all really depends on what's happening in the market. It seems like given a weaker market, candidates are less maybe greedy
Mhm.
and looking for lots of money. They're kind of asking questions around stability type things, right? So I think it's important to be in touch with what kind of market are you in, right? What is your strategy walking into it? What are the levers and buttons you have to push that you can really kind of accentuate what the strength of your offer is if compensation isn't one of the selling points. Um, and I think taking all those factors into consideration is really important because I'll just say it's been like a roller coaster ride through my career of what's in focus for candidates, right? And when the economy's weak or things are shaky, right, people have different needs and different things on their mind. So I think it's very important to really kind of think about all of those factors as well as you kind of put together your strategy and dial in on how to bring the candidate home, right? How to kind of sell them on this is the right move for them.
But that's also a point to not also take advantage of the candidates, right? You want to
Oh,
make a fair,
absolutely.
competitive offer, not to
Sure.
lowball them to get them because I can get them for that number doesn't mean you should, right?
No.
Because then you're going to get into other issues of you know them leaving and
Yeah, you
the
don't want
turnover
that
rates and things like
turnover.
that.
No, you absolutely don't want that turnover. No matter what your strategy is, you have to make sure you're being fair and competitive with your candidate and that they're coming in kind of all in, right? And that they're
Right.
excited about joining. They feel they have a fair offer that this is a win-win. So I think that's the goal, right? And if you haven't achieved that, then you really should rethink, you know, what your tactics are.
The other side of the strategy around data around offers is really trying to get a full disclosure on why they've declined, right? What was it? What really set it apart that they didn't want to take that? Because then you could use that data. Was it salary into another offer? Was it relocation? Was it,
Right.
a variety of different situations? But getting that really data points from them, that's where you can get a really good
Yeah.
strategy.
Well, truthfully, I think one thing we didn't touch on that I think is really important, we mention at least, is counteroffers, right?
Yes.
That's the big threat. And, how do we navigate those situations? And, I think we're seeing an increasing number of people actually boomerang back into old companies. At least I'm noticing some trends like that when I watch LinkedIn postings that people are kind of coming home, so to speak, to an employer they worked with previously. Um, so I think the counter offer threat is certainly real. But if you do your homework up front, both on the HR talent acquisition side and on the managerial side, to your point with Sydney, right? And saying, is she a threat to stay, right? She was looking for career mobility, promotion, right? All of those things. So, but I think the counter offer threat is real and something that, you have to be aware of and how to
Well, I
navigate.
mean, it's smart for a company to counter offer a really good employee to leave, right? Because you're the time investment, but on both sides, as a candidate, you've made a decision to leave and now they're trying to keep you to stay. How is that going to change? And is it really going to change? Do you have a target on your back? And these are all counter offer typical things. You could look it up on AI anywhere on, Google it. You could see all the counter offer discussions and pros and cons in doing that. Um, you got to be very careful into those things on accepting it. But the other factor is you got to look at cultures, and the cultures in different countries. It's a very common practice, and there's a few that we can talk and debate about that happens, and it's I want to say it's common practice, and that's another thing you have to be aware of into those
Sure.
countries when you're looking at global recruiting or even regional recruiting, depending where you live. Those things get really play into it, and that counter offer is a huge drop off point, which is frustrating, right, for everybody in those things. But counter offers, you as the recruiter, you're giving that conversation, you're kind of rebuttering, reconnecting back on all those topics on why they've decided to
Right.
leave, and that's where that candidate experience and that communication stays. Your job isn't done once they accept.
Right.
Your job is kind of done really after they've started, right?
Right.
And that's usually a little bit afterwards, and keep staying in communication. And that, I know onboarding and pre-boarding is a whole nother chapter that we're going to talk about another time, but that's huge to be able to help support, a good, obviously, offer conversation, but that,
Right.
next phase into actually getting them on board.
Right. And I know we all don't want to hear this earlier in the process, but truthfully, I think most counter offers can be almost somewhat sniffed out if we're really being honest with ourselves about red flags we're hearing early in the process. Right. So I think that probing and getting to know your candidate is essential. And I'm not always. Of course, there's always the, big surprise and there were no warning signs. But I think part of that, the way to mitigate that risk is really through that probing and dialogue and the why, understanding the why, the career motivation, and, taking the time with the candidate to listen to them because sometimes they need to say all those things out loud to really help form their mental readiness to make that move.
Mhm.
Because let's be honest, it's scary. Starting something new is scary. It's like, do I stay with the devil I know or the devil I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Are the, so let's be real. I mean, anyone who's been on the side of making a decision, especially in a long-term career, it's a scary thing. So I think, that's that counteroffer could feel like, well, it's the devil I know, right? Or, the
Yep.
what ifs. What if the economy tanks? What if I'm the new guy, right? In my current company, I'm not going to be the first on the chopping block, right? Everybody has those conversations. So I think that if you invest the time in talking through things like that with candidates, just kind of letting them have that therapeutic moment of all the
Yeah.
reasons, right? And hearing them say it out loud actually kind of helps shore up their readiness to leave. And I think that's something that everyone can do that doesn't cost anything other than time to really have those conversations. So,
It's time, and that's part of the relationship that you're having with that candidate and spending it and working with them, and you're going through the phases of a relationship like we talked in the previous episode of,
right.
you're getting to know them and their motivations and their concerns as they walk through it, and that's the job of the recruiter to really, at the right moment in time, poke at those things, right? To make sure that they're actually ready and not just
Mhm.
listening and trying to see what they're worth or what's out there. Sometimes that's okay because you've poked a bear and they're very passive into those things. And that's where the conversation in it, you have to manage that candidate a little differently versus someone that's been more proactively going after the role. So, again, knowing your candidate is huge into those things.
Right.
Coming back on time there, though, I know I shared a story. Did you have a story that you wanted to share, Jill?
I have one, but I think it's nothing earth shattering. I'll share a story about hiring a director into a technical role that I was working on for quite some time. It was a new product area for the business I was working in. So, it was really essential that we went outside to find that talent and, went through the whole courting process. The person would be walking away from a long term career in another company. But of course, at the 11th hour, they brought up, a surprise about the stock that they had and how much wasn't going to be vested, right? And what was this worth and all these other things, which was significant financially, to the bottom line of what the offer looked like. And, it was kind of an aha moment to say, like, how did that not come up earlier in the process? Right. So, um, in the end, we were able to bring the candidate in. It was costly. We didn't kind of really try to quantify or bridge that entire gap, but it was a definite showstopper, right? So it was an example of saying, okay, like maybe I need to have a checklist of all the different perks and types of things, right, for
Yep.
candidates. I don't know how it was missed. I don't know how it didn't come up in the process, but I will own it and say I never made that. I never made that mistake again, and I never had that thing be an obstacle. And like I said, the ending was a happy ending because the person joined, they stayed long term, right? It was a solvable problem, but that late learning of that really, threw a monkey wrench in things and really almost, kind of blew it up. So, for me, the takeaway from that situation was I need to sometimes not expect people to volunteer information. I need to kind of dig and throw out examples and, find other ways to get at information with candidates to make sure that I don't have any 11th hour surprises. So,
Yeah, they're fun, and when you get into the stock and vested and unvested and this whole schedules, and it's a complicated process, right? And it gets down to being a financial analyst at times, especially on the recruiting side of it, showcasing it back to them so they can all understand it. Because I've had some where, they had different bonus programs. So when were those getting paid off? And then our bonus program into quarterly pieces, and then different other incentives and a couple different offers. And really, it was this really long agreement and contract kind of highlighting different pieces to sum it up into of course, Excel
Right,
spreadsheet showcasing the numbers so the person could understand what they're receiving and when to be able to combat what they currently had.
right.
And that one worked out really well. I've had some where, and believe it or not, folks, and I'm sure you have too, I've had even director level folks or higher take less money, right? And because the
Mhm.
motivation was something else, it wasn't always
Right.
about money.
Yeah,
There's the opportunity, the growth, the other things, their current situation to that side of it.
right,
And that's really understanding the candidate and what they're willing to
right.
do.
Yeah.
um,
Well, one thing I'll just comment on this one, the real decision to spend the extra money, the surprise money, was really about credibility for the organization, saying if this person joins, given their reputation, given this
mm,
new growth and this new product area ability, it is absolutely worth the credibility it lends the organization and the foothold it gives the organization in being able to recruit top talent. People are going to follow this
sure.
person, right? So it was almost a way of saying, okay, I'm going to save all this money that I'm giving this person on recruiting fees, and I'm gaining credibility in the market with customers and other people. So, that was kind of part of it. But in any case, like you said, we all have a story, and I think as we want to really think about offers, we need to think about what does this candidate bring to the organization? How do we best craft an offer that's fair, competitive, and how do we bring the candidate home, right? Because nobody on either side of a process wants to invest so much time and kind of walk away empty, right? Without the win.
And that's one little, I don't want to say trick, but one little thing that goes on, in the last phases of it, of are we really going to, both sides, right? The candidate and the company, are we going to walk away because of X dollar? Right? Is it
Mhm,
worth it?
mhm.
The time invested on both sides and different things. And that's a hard decision that leaders and individuals have to make. And there's a line in the sand that gets drawn on both sides eventually. But that's the sum of it all is, how can we get to the good arrangement that's competitive for both of us? How can we, get this partnership, because it should be a long-term partnership, and come in shaking hands, not being adversarial and upset into those things, right? So a little bit of the win-win, but as long as it doesn't, break the bank and make sense for the organization, make sense for the candidate.
Right.
And really, the other sum up that I would have is on the whole offer discussion and conversation is communication, disclosure, transparency on both sides, right? And nowadays, especially with pay transparency and everything else, just talk about it. It's not scary conversation. Let's put it all on the table instead of wasting time. Where are we at? What can we do? Do we think we can get to an agreement within whatever dollars, and be flexible to be able to drive through that, because it's a long-term commitment on both sides.
Absolutely. And I think you were very on point in saying that at the end, no matter what happens, how difficult the negotiations are, we have to shake hands in the end and be excited about this new beginning and leave all that in the past, right? I've seen some people
Yep.
feel a little beaten down, a little negative, right? And hold some animosity. That really can't happen. The whole point of this is starting out a new relationship together. And I think no matter what happens in the negotiation process, if we get to a win, we get to the signed offer, we get to the candidate starting, we all need to kind of say, this is day one, right? We've gotten to know each other a little bit, and let's walk into this on a positive note.
Let's celebrate, enjoy, and hopefully they bring a referral in as well. So sorry, I had to put it
There's
in
your
on the recruiting
TA
side.
guy hoping for the
You know,
referral, right? I'm
absolutely.
with you. That saves a lot of money, and we love our third party recruiters. We're going to talk about that and bring potentially some of them on down the road. But we also love the internal sourcing and the money that saves the company. So
Absolutely. Well, everyone, hopefully you enjoyed. If you have some stories or comments, please put them, would like to share, please put them in the comments. It's a very fun topic that everyone has some good stories and conversations about. So hopefully you enjoyed the mock conversation we had at the start, and really appreciate you to join and follow and share it with a friend.
thanks, everyone. Bye.